All right. And we have our own Bill Voight doing a program that I think will be interesting. Social, economic, and political conditions in Missouri at the onset of the Civil War. So Bill, it is your program, you take it.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our remote participants. Tonight's program is social, as Harold was saying, social, political, and economic conditions of pre-Civil War Missouri. I can get this to toggle. Push it again, I guess.
Not going.
There we go.
Did it go?
And I don't know if it skipped some or not.
So use the right and left arrows.
Oh, the right and left. Oh, okay,
I
cool.
lied to you before. I'm a big liar.
It's with but a slight reservation that I present this subject matter. The political economy of Civil War Missouri can offer a painful legacy. And I'm sensitive that I'm undertaking this subject almost literally in the shadow of the University of Missouri, an institution that is home to more scholarly contributions to this subject matter than undoubtedly any other institution. Please know that I'm not a scholar, rather I'm but a retired grandfather who likes to read history books. This program should be just south of 1 hour in length.
Just watching the video of the Civil War Roundtable at Columbia. They have a meeting.
Show me you can do that.
Stacy, I'm having difficulty in getting my pages to toggle.
Is it not going again?
I guess maybe I'm just not pressing down hard enough.
You have to press with conviction.
Or the problem with that is I don't just feel like I'm skipping slides or
Did
something.
we skip one? Maybe we
I
didn't.
really don't know.
Well, let's try something.
It's your
different.
show.
That might be easy.
Well, I'm spinning
Give her a try.
a working computer keyboard.
And remember, Harold, he used to be a grandfather, but he's retired now, so. that only-
Oh, man, we're getting way ahead of my program.
Yeah, we are.
We won't look.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, okay.
Uh-uh. You know what? One click on the mouse.
Oh, well, yeah, I like that. Yeah, I can do that.
Let's try that.
Thank you. Oh, yeah. This presentation will explore the social, political, and economic conditions of the following Missourians. They are the focus of this presentation because they were leaders of the 4 political parties appearing on the ballot for the 1860 presidential election. Those individuals are Thomas Hart Benton, Hamilton Gamble, Frank Blair Jr., and together Claiborne Jackson and Sterling Price. I would note, as with most Missourians at the onset of the Civil War, most were not born in Missouri. All of these individuals appearing on the political ballot and these individuals representing the political parties in Missouri were all slaveholders. It should be noted that Thomas Hart Benton had evolving points of view on that subject. To my knowledge, nobody else ever really did. There's a bibliography, just a few of the books that I used. I did not do any primary empirical research, but I did rely heavily on the lower left, Dwayne Meyer's wonderful Missouri history book, my college history book at Lincoln University. The upper left-hand corner, To Make Men Free, is my book. I'll be happy to lend that to anyone that suffers from insomnia. But, the lower right-hand corner, I continue to be a devoted fan of Professor Sinisi, and I do not know his military rank, so I'll just call him Professor. I've noted all of the history books that cover, for example, infantry, cavalry, tactics and strategy and munitions, they all always seem to offer a political and social and economic framework, and I draw heavily upon that. I'm also, a lot of this material has come from the online access to the Center for Missouri Studies at the State Historical Society. It's a wonderful resource. It's important to know the formation of the Republican Party. When the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise, outrage erupted, instantly remaking the political landscape. The Whig Party virtually dissolved overnight. As early as May the 9th, 1854, 30 congressmen endorsed a new name that finally struck. They called themselves the Republicans. Perhaps at this point in our presentation, we should ask ourselves, what does any of this is all well and good, but what's any of this really had to do with the Civil War? To answer that question, I have drawn upon something my father's generation. It's the cartoon of Willie and Joe says to Willie, by the way, Willie, remind me again, just what are we fighting for? And Willie replies, well, Joe, it's like this. The other day I got stuck pulling battalion KP, and a couple of the guys from Charlie Company started talking about that very question. So I figured I'd just as well chime in a little bit. Before long, we were all arguing about it. The next thing we knew, the officer in charge of the mess hall came over and told us if we did not stop wasting time talking about stuff like that, he'd make sure we never got off KP. And Joe responds, yeah, Willie, I get what you mean. I bet you guys didn't waste any more time arguing about what we're fighting for. The election of 1860, there were four parties: Constitutional Unionists, Northern Republicans, Northern Democrat, Southern Democrat, and Republican. And a particular note, the results of Missouri, we notice that Stephen Douglas and John Bell, the historians call those guys kind of moderates. The moderates prevailed overwhelmingly in Missouri, as contrasted with results nationally where Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas were among the leaders. But the Constitutional Union, obviously Abraham Lincoln won. The Constitutional Unionist Party, they opposed secession and expansion of slavery into the territories, but they wanted to maintain the institution of slavery as it then existed. They refused to join either the Republican or the Democratic Party. The Northern Democrats in the Democratic Party further split into two factions during the war. The War Democrats, who supported President Lincoln, and the Copperheads, sometimes known as the Peace Democrats, who strongly opposed President Lincoln. The Southern Democrats advocated for the expansion of slavery into the territories and for strong enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. The Republican Party, their main platform position was an opposition to expanding slavery into the West. However, it should be noted, at least it's my understanding that I didn't read it, but President Lincoln in his inaugural address committed to not destroying the institution, at least where it already existed. The repercussions of the 1860 election in Missouri, it became apparent that much of the South would not abide by the election of Abraham Lincoln. The Unconditional Union Party was first established in Missouri in 1861 after that splintered election. It only operated in the border states, and it was an attempt to consolidate Missouri's adherents of Lincoln, Bell, and Douglas. It was an attempt to consolidate three parties into one. It supported the preservation of the Union at all cost. They worked to resist the secessionists by political action, but were committed to preserve the Union by force if necessary. It was dissolved in 1866. The Unconditional Union Party. Further repercussions, the Missouri secessionists broke away and formed a separatist government and eventually took up arms against the Union Army. Militarily, Sterling Price was forced to evacuate Missouri to Arkansas in early 1862. We ask ourselves, why were the vote results from Missouri so different from the rest of the country? The answer is there's no single answer as to how Missourians viewed themselves. The state's varied internal geography fostered localized subcultures. For example, booming free labor St. Louis, with the largest percentage of immigrants of any city in the US. There's a typo. The slave labor plantations of the Boonslick and the sparsely populated Ozarks were worlds apart from one another. Those are three subcultures, geographic areas of Missouri. I'm not overlooking the Northwest, the Platte Purchase. I'm not overlooking Southwest Missouri. To this day is part of like the Northwest Arkansas. It's a huge economic engine. And I'm certainly not overlooking the boot heel of Missouri in terms of subcultures and so forth. I was in Malden, Missouri recently, or a few months ago, and I want you to know I've been all over the Mississippi Delta and the lowlands of South Carolina, but I have never seen as much cotton as I saw down at Malden last fall. It must have been a banner year, but I don't mean to overlook those areas, but we're going to focus tonight mostly on the Boonslick area. The Boonslick region was the home of something called the Central Clique. It was a close-knit group of planter politicians who dominated state politics during the antebellum period. An abundance of fertile soil and access by river to New Orleans made the central region the most economically prominent region of the state. Locals of the time period viewed themselves and their area as the most advanced, most commercial, and most successful part of the state. The greater Boonslick region, if I may use that term, was also home to a very strategic resource. Some 42 country banks, notice not county banks, but country banks, whose ownership had much power and little oversight. Although these bank officers were small in number, their presidents and cashiers effectively, if not in actuality, controlled the state's money supply and most of the available commercial credit. When the Boonslick bankers supported the losing side in the war, this institutional power caused great damage. Little Dixie is a section of the state where the local culture historically paralleled the Upper South. I would argue that it did not parallel it. It was, in fact, the Upper South. During the antebellum period, massive waves of migrating Southern farmers and planters flooded the area and transplanted their slave-dependent culture and economy. Large quantities of hemp, tobacco, and livestock were produced here. And this, to me, is most important. Slave owners were proficient in adapting, chattel labor to a diversified economy. Owners with excess hands rented out their surplus. Slaves provided virtually all of the wage labor in the region, although obviously the slaves didn't get the wages. Lastly, despite the doubts of some critics, slavery appears not to have slowed the spread of technology. By 1860, local farmers spent just as much on machinery as their counterparts in the North, some $500 per farmer, that according to Joseph Stiles. And I'm a admirer of Joseph Stiles. Here in the Boone's Lick, 1 out of 4, and sometimes 1 out of 3 people were Black of African descent. Agriculture brought great wealth and commerce to this area. It also fostered manufacturing, as seen in endeavors such as brickmaking and the tobacco stemmeries and rope walks in nearly every town. Enslaved people labored in virtually every aspect of daily life. They served as teamsters, personal servants, maids, cooks, and skilled workers such as carpenters, cooperers, blacksmiths, and stonemasons. Almost every businessman owned 1 or more slaves, and they could be found in workshops, stables, warehouses, rope walks, sawmills, and of course, aboard the many, many steamships plying our rivers.
Bill,
Yes,
what is a rope walk?
Harold.
It's a long hallway where the strands of hemp are twisted together to make rope. And so the longer it is, the longer the rope is.
I was thinking boardwalk, and I walk on strands of rope, but okay, thank you.
Yeah, the question for the audience was, what is a rope walk? And it's basically where hemp was wound together to make ropes. Those went aboard ships, supplying ropes on ships worldwide. And I'm not one, the sentence right here ends up with aboard the many, many steamships plying the rivers. I'm not one to use a lot of adjectives, and I try to avoid adverbs altogether because they're so misused today. But there truly were a lot of steamships on our steamboats on our river. Speaking of manufacturing, in Arrow Rock, Dr. John Sappington was said to have employed some of his slaves in the pharmaceutical industry in the production of anti-malaria pills. I would like to remind the audience at this point to not let these statistical overviews let us strip the slave economy of its humanity. These people were human beings. And if I may say, their owners were human beings also. People that benefited from all of this. Speaking of working in stables, here's an interesting statistic that I came across. The state of Missouri led all states in the number of horses that were here. 362,000, pretty much dwarfed Virginia. Colonial times where all of this got started. Virginia only had a mere 288,000. And Kentucky somewhere in the middle. By county, I would note Boone County led by what I would consider pretty well, overwhelmingly all counties in Missouri with the quantity of horses. And I don't know about mules and everything else, but it probably goes along with it. So that I found that to be an interesting statistic. Missouri had more horses than any other state. This was a horse culture. Banks facilitated industry, commerce, and personal needs. By early 1860, Missouri had 9 currency issuing banks doing business in 42 locations, counting parents and branches. The banks served both of Missouri's 2 main industries, the Southern trade and the Western trade. Missouri's farms and workshops produced support commodities for the plantations of the Cotton South, and they supplied the material needs of the Western settlers passing through the state. The Southern trade was the more profitable of the 2. Missouri produced horses, mules, and oxen for draft animals, corn and hogs to feed both themselves and the enslaved people. Missouri produced hemp for cotton baling and tobacco for wrapper leaf in making fine cigars. That according to Geiger. Overall, Missouri formed 1.8 of a classic trading triangle. The South sold cotton to England and New England and used the money to pay Missouri's farmers and merchants. The Missourians then bought finished goods from the Northeast. Missouri's overall balance of trade was favorable with the South and the West and unfavorable with the East. St. Louis and the Missouri River counties west of the city, where most of the branch banks were, served both the Western and Southern businesses. St. Louis was a great collection point for all this commerce, physical distribution, warehousing, transport, wholesale and retail sales, and banking, dominating the entire Missouri Valley and the upper Mississippi Valley above New Orleans. And one last point about Little Dixie. Don't confuse Missouri with Oklahoma. They have one too. I didn't either, Harold, until I got researching this a little bit. As to the individuals representing, in my estimation, best representing the various political parties, Claiborne Fox Jackson. I have labeled him the Dean of Missouri Fire Eaters. He was elected governor in 1860 in large measure by presenting himself, along with his Lieutenant Governor Thomas Reynolds, as moderate supporters of the Union. But then, immediately after the election, pushed for secession. Others of note are Senator David Rice Atchison, leader of something called the F Street Mess, F Street being the place in Washington, D.C., where they had they all lived in a boarding house together. Trustin Polk and Benjamin Stringfellow, who I view as their chief propagandist. I want to be kind to General Price. He was, to some point, I think, to a great extent, a voice of moderation. However, he's said to have been greatly impacted by the events of the Camp Jackson affair, which I suppose if you were the commanding general and a couple thousand of your soldiers were captured and disarmed, it might have an impact on your viewpoints. Those are two examples of the Southern Democrats in Missouri in 1860. In terms of a Missourian who, in my view, best representative of the Republican Party would be Hamilton Gamble. As war clouds were forming, Gamble was said to have been a calming influence to slaveholders' fears. But by 1863, he was under attack by radicals who accused him of protecting slavery and rebel sympathizers. According to Rudy Keller, some of his foes accused him of organizing the enrolled Missouri militia as a counterweight to federal power in the state. Prior to the war, in 1815, Hamilton Gamble was elected to the 3-judge Missouri Supreme Court as a Whig. Back then, we had 3 jurists on the Supreme Court, and they were elected. Thank goodness we don't do that anymore. He was a Howard County slaveholder, I believe, not New Franklin, but I believe even Old Franklin, across the river from Boonville. He was, and he lived in St. Louis as well as Howard County. But what I found very interesting, he often represented enslaved persons in court, especially in something called freedom suits, the majority of which appear to have resulted in settlement in the slave's favor. He dissented in the Missouri Supreme Court decision in the Dred Scott case. The vote was 2-1. He was the dissenting vote. He wrote in his dissenting opinion, "Times may have changed, public feelings may have changed, but principles have not and do not change. And in my judgment, there can be no safe basis for judicial decisions except for those principles which are immutable." Today, sometimes we hear people say that as a judge, they would not make the law, they would only interpret the law. Well, when Hamilton Gamble said that, he really meant it. He maintained that Dred Scott, along with his wife, Dred Scott's wife, Harriet, and their children, Eliza and Lizzie, Gamble maintained they were free because Scott had been held illegally as a slave while a resident in a free state. This was a 28-year-old precedent set in 1824, which maintained that once free, always free. This situation was somewhat common due to military officers who owned slaves and took them to the various military outposts. I wish I didn't have to write this last bullet point. We are in the middle of the 21st century and looking back 200 years ago when these policies were set, it is unfair for us to use our system of morality and ethics to judge them. But I have to say, Hamilton Gamble was said to have been a member of the American Colonization Society, although I personally do not know. I didn't do enough research to find out if that indeed was factual. It probably was. The American Colonization Society. He was a member of that. Hamilton Gamble's political battles were to keep Missouri in the Union. He was appointed provisional governor and died before the war's end from the after effects of a broken right arm. From what I could tell, he was hounded to death by the radicals of the day. As war approached and the political atmosphere began to heat up, stare decisis, which is to stand by things already decided, no longer mattered to two of the three judges on the Missouri Supreme Court. The court's decision ignored English common law and the admonitions of Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Paper number 78. To these Missouri judicial activists and their brethren on the US Supreme Court who ruled 7-2 against Scott, their poor legal reasoning has gone down in history as the worst decision ever rendered. The decision, and along with incessant meddling by James Buchanan, elected officials are not supposed to meddle into the judiciary, but that sort of thing greatly contributed to the start of the Civil War 4 years later, not to mention the Panic of 1857 that came about as a result of this Dred Scott decision, but had a tremendous impact on the North, but no impact on the South. Missouri's, my representative, as an example of unconditional unionists in the 1864 election, was Major General Francis P. Blair Jr. His father was I think his father, also named Frank Blair, was was an advisor to President Lincoln, as I recall reading. Immediately after South Carolina's secession in December 1861, and believing that Southern leaders were planning to carry Missouri into that movement, Frank Blair began active efforts to prevent it. He was instrumental in appointing Nathaniel Lyon as commander, and together removing 20,000 rifled muskets from the St. Louis arsenal across the river to Illinois. Although a slaveholder himself, Blair was an outspoken free soiler, and the Blairs were unwavering supporters of Abraham Lincoln. Among many other campaigns, Blair fought at or near Vicksburg, Chattanooga, and Atlanta before marching to the sea. I believe General Blair was one of General Sherman's staff generals. By war's ending, Blair was financially ruined, having spent much of his private money in support of the Union. Like his father and brother, he left the Republican Party on account of its Reconstruction policies. One of the reasons I wanted to do this program, I've learned a lot myself. There's so many different time periods and a lot of switching of parties, and I've always found it confusing to understand the political parties because it's relative. It seems to change over time, and the individuals going in and out of these parties always kind of confuse me. The last thing I have to say is the last bullet point. General Blair, Frank Blair, appears to have been, actually there's no appearances, he was in fact of the opinion that the issue of slavery could be addressed by gradual emancipation and resettlement to Central and South America. Lastly, we have an example of the Northern Democrats in Missouri at the onset of the Civil War. I've chosen Thomas Hart Benton. He's hands down the most logical choice to represent the Northern Democrats during this time period. And I wanted to say something about him, his personal, I guess, character, you could call it. He had an imposing appearance. He had an air of confidence. He carried himself with an erect posture. He was a dramatic and forceful speaker and an excellent writer. He was industrious. He paid careful attention to his health. He possessed an inquisitiveness of mind and an ability to assimilate large bodies of information. Thomas Hart Benton was devoted to the legislative process with an extraordinary ability to influence public opinion. He loved to campaign and regularly turned down offers to accept other positions. Now, this is my little note, the last bullet point. He had an ability to assume large bodies of information. I think he probably had a really good staff as well. Benton also had his flaws. Please notice the picture. This is a statue of Senator Benton in St. Louis, at Lafayette Park. It shows him in I guess that's a Roman toga, and he's holding a scroll. It appears to be in his right hand. Is kind of like a Moses come down from the mountain lawgiver kind of guy. And I thought it might be interesting to just to pose and use what's the word I wanted to use? Iconography. That's the word. I wanted to learn to say that word. Iconography. It's to make a statue, and it's a form of art to show people a certain way, and to compare and contrast that to his flaws. He was said to be arrogant, and he had feelings, I suppose, from time to time of superiority to other people. He possessed an inclination to turn political conflicts into personal feuds. I'm sure he could be dogmatic and contemptuous of those who may disagree. He had a tendency to be abusive and vindictive in his political debate. But to his credit, he would sometimes make friends of old enemies, with Andrew Jackson perhaps being the best example. Thomas Hart Benton had some very bad experiences, early experiences with banks in Missouri. He was a stockholder in the Bank of St. Louis, the Bank of Missouri. Both of those, of course, folded due to overextension of credit. Specie, whether it's bullion or coin or gold or silver, bullion or coin, this notion of getting lands from the government on credit, reselling it to immigrants for gold and silver, Benton was opposed to those kinds of things. Essentially, the Democratic Party in Missouri and their leaders, they declared war on the Bank of St. Louis. Didn't make too many friends that way, I guess. The legacy of Thomas Hart Benton, and I'm not calling him a Democrat or a Republican or anything, I just call him an American, was the most influential Missouri politician during his 30 years as senator. I think that's an understatement. certainly in all of the 19th century, and I would argue even the 20th century. He's he's the most influential Missourian in Congress or in the Senate. Among numerous other accomplishments, he had a most significant impact on the westward expansion of the country and the gradual formation of the nation's banking system. As much as any other person, Thomas Hart Benton for years correctly diagnosed the approaching slavery crisis and worked tirelessly to avoid disunion. But without a popular national leader such as Andrew Jackson, with whom he could associate politically, various coalitions of Benton's own party forced his demise. He is buried in Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis. In summary, actually in conclusion, over the decade ending in 1870, Missouri's population increased almost as much as the combined total for all 10 former Confederate states after the Civil War. With the rest of that decade, the period of great population growth in Missouri. In the decades following the war, plantations almost disappeared from the Boone's Lick, as did nearly the entire African-American population from the Boone's Lick. Go up to Glasgow today, and I don't know if you would see hardly any Black people there. At one time, it was 40% African-American. Missouri, after the Civil War, increasingly differed from the former Confederate states in population, demography, agriculture, land ownership, and politics. I put a parenthetical there. I'm not so sure about the politics. But we increasingly differed from the rest of the South, except for a few state and local historians. This era of Missouri has been virtually forgotten. There are some national historians that have not forgotten us, but mostly it's a matter of local history nowadays. If you're interested in this subject, there are numerous internet-based forums that can further your knowledge. They're mostly not-for-profit type corporations. Among my favorite is Missouri's Little Dixie Heritage Foundation, which makes regular posts on Facebook. And this concludes my presentation tonight. So I guess we got some time for questions. Oh, okay. There you go.
Early on, you said that nationwide, the two top vote getters, I think, in the vote of 1860 were Lincoln and Stephen Douglas.
Yeah, we can probably go back to that real quick.
I was
Hey, right there. Go down a little bit further.
Number, please.
Number 8. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, right where if we can move that over to the left. Yeah, there we go. There's the, I should probably get up and read that. In Missouri, Stephen Douglas had 35%, and John Bell, the constitutional unionist, had 35%. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, had roughly 19%, and Abraham Lincoln got 10%. And you can see the blue right here. Forgive me, I should be using the pointer. I'm sure that's distracting to our viewers, but in Abraham Lincoln in Missouri in 1860, I'm pretty sure that's probably either Gasconade or it's Gasconade County. And I guess that's St. Louis, the city of St. Louis County. Right there, that's Abraham. Those are the only two places Abraham Lincoln carried in the election of 1860.
The national numbers then?
Okay, President Lincoln won with 40% of the vote. Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, I think he was from Illinois, I think. He finished with 30%. So it was 40% to 30%. Lincoln beat Douglas.
Lincoln got one vote in Columbia. Most of the people think it was Mr. Todd, it was Nancy's cousin.
We can go back to, I'm sorry, we can go back to the, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Well, it's really kind of interesting to me about the Republican vote in Missouri. Missouri's a slave state, and at the time, the parties printed the ballots. States didn't provide the ballots, the parties did. So you had to have a party structure, a party organization in a state to have a ballot. Lincoln wasn't on the ballot, not on a ballot in the deep South states because there was no Republican Party organization. But you're a party that only existed since 1854. Missouri is a conservative a conservative slaveholding state. And a lot of people think, oh, it's funny, Lincoln only got 10% of the vote. I would argue just the opposite. In a state that only has had, a party that's existed for 8 years, 6 to 8 years, second election, national election, and he gets 10% of the vote in a slaveholding state. I think that's pretty impressive for a Republican Party structure in Missouri. I mean, it's probably comparable. I don't know off the top of my head what the other like moderate slaveholding states, upper South, like Kentucky and Delaware and Maryland. I don't know what Lincoln got there, probably comparable. But I think it's actually kind of impressive that a party that's only been in 2 presidential elections in a slaveholding state got 10% of the vote.
Good point, Andy.
Yeah.
Well,
Wasn't that 10% mostly the St. Louis Germans?
Germans did, that's a lot of the vote.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I mean, he carried only St. Louis County and Gasconade County, which does have a lot of German population. That doesn't mean there weren't Lincoln votes elsewhere. He just didn't carry and Boone County was very much a slaveholding county.
Fremont
I
was the
don't-
first Republican candidate 4 years earlier. And so
Right.
he had not a political clout in Missouri.
Right.
Fremont.
Right, and Blair, who was one of the founders of the Republican Party in Missouri. Yeah, I mean, guys like that certainly, where they had most influence was in St. Louis and again, some of the German population, for what that's worth.
When you were talking about the Little Dixie oligarchy, the central clique, how many people are you talking about there in terms of that group of influential politicians that largely controlled state government? How many people are we looking at? Is it 10, 20, hundreds? I mean.
Well, thank you, Stacy. The question is, how many people of the planter class were there in the Boone's Lick and Little Dixie? And I honestly don't have a number. What I do know, in 1860, Missouri's 10 largest cities only numbered 196,000 people. And all of our 10 largest cities, I'm not sure if we knew how many people were living in rural areas or how accurate that data may be, but there was just a couple of 100,000, 196,000 people in our 10 largest cities. So comparatively, there must have been very few. Sorry, I don't have a better answer.
So we're probably looking at maybe less than 30 or 40.
People, individuals?
Of the individuals in that political group.
They had a lot of power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Price was part of Little Dixie.
Claiborne Jackson was from there. Marmadukes were from up
The
there.
whole family.
Sappingtons, all that, and that's a ton of power. Yeah. Well, the guy in the legislator that introduced the state legislation that would force Benton after he was out of the Senate. No, he was still in the Senate, that would force him to vote a certain way, and Benton didn't want to do it, was a politician from the Boone's Lick area as well. So those guys had certainly a disproportional, we hear about that word used a lot anymore, but that group of politicians had a disproportional influence on Missouri politics.
Well, they had a lot of money too.
They had a lot of money too. Yeah,
I think there's a correlation there.
yeah, there is. Are you saying that money and politics? Well, I learned something tonight.
Thank you.
Well, if you have the Bank of St. Louis, you can print your own money.
Yeah.
I would like to, I'll address population during this time period this way. There's quite a bit of statistics here. I'm going to try not to mess it up, but between 1820 and 1860, population of Missouri, not the people passing through in Western expansion and manifest destiny and all of that, but the population of Missouri between 1820 and 1860 increased 18-fold.
Yeah.
To a point, well, and I got to thinking, well, what would that be like if that happened today? If we increased our population 18-fold over the next 40 years. Well, there's 6.1 billion people in Missouri now. And if we increase that 18-fold over the next 40 years, the figure is staggering. If you would live here, to give you an idea of the influx that you
120 million.
109 million. And we would increase by 109 million over the next 40 years. It was roughly a third of the population of the United States right now. But I broke that down, that 109 million, we're increasing 109 million over the next 40 years. The average cruise ship that goes in the Caribbean holds between 2,000 and 4,000 people. So I took an average of 3,000 people. How many cruise ships would have to tie up at the dock there in St. Louis to unload 109 million people? That works out to 2.5 cruise ships per day unloading in St. Louis, coming into Missouri for the next 40 years, every day. That's what I can tell you about population at that time, Stacy.
What was the reason for Missouri being the largest horse producer? Then, did you have any?
Did not. That's come, the note I had with that was from agricultural census at that time. I don't know. I did not explore that any further. That is the reference is there, but I didn't do any research on it.
Well, you had a lot of immigration, not foreign immigration, but
From Virginia.
yeah,
Kentucky.
Oh, yeah.
Virginians that settled in Kentucky, and then they settled in Missouri, and they raised horses and mules there. So it's kind of a natural. I mean, that's kind of where I've always.
The chapter of the book where I took this from was just talking about Missouri's horse culture in that time, and many of these, of course, were thoroughbreds.
Yeah.
But I don't know anything beyond that.
Well, in the East, as you know, the landowners had multiple children, typically they didn't always split those up. The second and third and fourth sons had to go west. They had to go
Good point.
somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
Great point.
Yeah.
And I think too, Virginia, as the Tidewater, the Piedmont primarily, of course, Appalachia and the mountains. I just think perhaps Missouri by 1860 was probably more conducive to the need for having horses for whatever reason.
Well, the lack of good roads made horseback more compatible with them than carriages.
And it was a big state, right?
Yeah, a lot of,
You're
a
not
lot
gonna
of
take
it,
very
yeah.
many horses
Big
in
state,
there.
yeah. And plus it's a profitable enterprise too. Horses are always going to be in demand. And mules especially.
Does anyone from our shut-ins have any questions? Dave, haven't heard much from you in a while.
Well, I was just thinking, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I just could say it. Well done presentation. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Stephen.
Dave, go ahead.
I was just thinking, with respect to the population increase, I wonder how much land was available for, whatever it was, 64 acres and a horse or whatever it was. How much of the acreage in the state was available for kind of resettlement as opposed to Kansas and Iowa?
I honestly don't have any knowledge of that, Dave. I just don't have any, I couldn't even hazard a guess. I mean, going back to things like Spanish land grants and stuff, I don't know how the distribution of land in Missouri ended up the way it is now. I just really don't have any idea.
It's going to be a lot more open in earlier in Missouri's history than later. Like Homestead Act, not that really is relevant here, but Homestead Act didn't exist till 1862, and that's westward territories. But when you mentioned the Spanish land grants, a lot of people were getting land under those old Spanish land grants. Of course, the legitimacy of those was pretty hairy, but
Yeah.
a lot of land in Missouri probably in the 1820s and 30s. But when you're getting into like 1850s, not going to be a lot of new land in Missouri for settlement. It's going to be owned by somebody.
That's right. Good point. It's going to be owned by the time of the Civil War. Almost every square acre is going to be owned by someone.
Yeah.
The part of history that interests me personally, and I would love to have the time to research, is soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War. It was very common for them to be awarded land. In fact, I had a couple of ancestors that came to Missouri that way, although I don't know any details. But there were a lot of Revolutionary War soldiers were granted land, especially in Kentucky, and I think Missouri, and undoubtedly Tennessee. But I don't know any details.
I'm not sure in Missouri. Kentucky, yes, Tennessee. But in the War of 1812, they were given grants in Western Missouri.
That's a good point. Yeah.
When I used to examine titles in Bates County, a lot of them would go back to that, that time.
Yes, and of course, we know there was, that's a very good point, Jim. I hadn't read where there were too many. In fact, I don't know of any Revolutionary War grants that were awarded in Missouri, land grants in Missouri, including my ancestor. I think it's also interesting, and I don't know the details, but when they had the great earthquake in the Boot Hill in 1811, there was a lot of, somehow or another, those people ended up in central Missouri with land, and I don't know the details.
The other thing to think about is the river system in Missouri, not just the Missouri, but the Osage provided a means of transportation. St. Clair, it was destroyed early in the war. Osceola, thank you.
Yeah.
That was a river port.
Yeah.
Right.
And Warsaw, yeah.
So a tremendous amount of transportation up that, and even up to Papinsville and Bates County. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did a college term paper. I have a 4-year degree, but I did a college term paper on steamboats in Missouri. Forgot the year, but they went all the way to Osceola on the Osage, and I think all the way to Jerome on the Gasconade during flood stage. They were going everywhere.
Well, that's one reason that the capital is where it is, because it had to be within a certain amount of miles from the mouth of the Osage, because that was such a primary transportation route.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jim.
There's a couple of Revolutionary War veterans buried in the Columbia Cemetery.
Couple of
There are several. My wife has too.
Right.
Oh yeah.
That area. So.
Well, you mentioned Benton, and that's good, because Benton, I think, gets a little overlooked sometimes. I mean, he was dead before the war started, but his influence and his power for 30 years, and a lot of it has to do with that population increase in Missouri, because we always think of the big three in the U.S. Senate for a lot of years. You think of Calhoun in the South as kind of the primary senator for Southern rights, and Daniel Webster in the North, kind of the adversary there, and Henry Clay is the great compromiser. But really, I think we need to look at the Senate for a lot of those years as the big four, because Benton was the primary and most powerful senator from what's the New West. And then as the New West gets more population, not just Missouri, but as the New West gets more population, Benton's power increased. And I put Benton on the same level as those other three. He doesn't get the notoriety, but he should. In fact, Benton's I'm not a hero worship kind of guy. I never have been, but Benton has been kind of one of my Missouri heroes. Now, I disagree with him vehemently on monetary policy, but, but I do think he's someone that we should recognize more. for his
Tremendous influence, no
Huge
doubt.
influence.
Andy, was it Benton's statue that was replaced by Truman? Just
Yes.
recently?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's here.
So it's a historic.
Yeah, they just
state
got it.
historical society.
Yeah. When I've been in the US Capitol, I don't
40
recall.
tons.
Yeah, it's a big sucker. But I mean, to me, it'll be good to see it here because when I was in Statuary Hall, I don't recall seeing Benton. I saw Blair. I really thought that Blair would be the one that would be removed.
Well, if they did that, though, Truman was a Democrat. So, and the thing was, they were not going to replace a Republican with a Democrat, so it had to be Benton.
Of course, how many Missourians now know who Frank Blair was? Of course, on the other hand, how many Missourians know who Thomas R. Benton was? Never, in
The grade school here in town, Benton,
Yeah.
is named for him.
Yeah.
And I did some research and did a portrait for them at that time.
Okay.
And there was some question about his dueling and
Yeah.
how appropriate it was
right.
to have a school name for him.
Yeah. Well, hey, Sean Jackson lived to tell about it, so that's not many people got to do that, because they were friends, and then they absolutely hated each other, and then later on they reconciled. So yeah.
But just a quick question.
Yes.
The 4 books you showed earlier, I saw the Last Hurrah, but I couldn't make out who the author was of that one.
Gary Sinise.
Kyle Sinise.
Kyle.
Oh, okay. So, well, I know that guy.
Oh, Gary's the actor.
Yeah.
Gary's a movie star.
He was, Sinise was a professor at the Citadel, when he wrote that book,
Yeah,
I
still is.
think. Still is?
Yeah.
Oh,
I
okay.
think so.
Is that in Carolina?
South Carolina, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and what I found interesting, I've forgotten where he's originally from, but it's not from this area of the country, but I think he was a staff officer at Fort Leavenworth, and he liked history and things. I suspect that's where he began to develop an interest in the border wars and guerrillas and that sort of thing. And I rely on The Last Hurrah as a pretty definitive book by Professor Sinise.
It's one of the best books on the subject.
It is, yeah. If you're interested in Civil War in Missouri and haven't read that, shame on you. You need to. It's a brilliant
I
book.
think it's in the Wilson's Creek bookstore. I mean, it looks familiar now. That's why it didn't.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic.
Thank you all. I've enjoyed everything since I've been a member of the roundtable. I love strategy and tactics and munitions and battles and cavalry and infantry and cannons. But thanks for putting up with my political commentary.
Thank you very much.
Stop recording.
Any other comments?
Oh, I discovered on YouTube that they have old episodes